Hey, John Hickok here. Welcome to the first episode of My One Take. It's a new series that I'm doing where I'm basically going to sit down in front of a camera just like this and kind of give you my opinion on something, my take on something, and I'm going to do the whole thing in one take. All right, so that's where the clever part comes in. My one take. So I don't know. I thought of that like literally 10 minutes ago. So I hope you guys like the title. But that's what it is. I'm sticking with it. Okay, so in this episode, I'm going to talk about drugs and guns. All right, that's kind of when you hear those two together, it just kind of makes you go like, oh man, it's scary, you know. But they have a lot to do with each other, and I think that there's some things that need to be talked about. It's kind of a sensitive topic to talk about in the gun community because people have a wide range of opinions about the way that they feel about drugs and whether they're illegal drugs or legal drugs, and especially as they relate to guns. And it's a sensitive issue, but I want to talk about it because it's important. Okay, so I've got some notes here. The first thing is gun violence and drug violence. Now, first, let me clarify. When I use the term gun violence, I know it triggered some of you out there, because it's a big thing people will say in the gun community or gun culture, whatever, that there's no such thing as gun violence. Well, okay, if you really want to be super technical about it, I guess, but the way that I mean the term and the way that most people mean the term when they say gun violence is they don't mean that a gun walked around and shot someone. They mean that a person used a gun to commit an act of violence, right? And that does happen. People do use guns to commit violent acts. That's a real thing that happens. And then drug violence, the way that I think of that term as talking about violence associated with the trade of drugs, not necessarily someone drugging another person. I think of it as in, someone gets shot over some turf battle, or a drug deal gone wrong, that kind of thing. People who are shot because of drugs, not violence from the drugs themselves. So the connection here that they have is that a lot of the times when people are killed over drugs, because illegal drugs, I need to specify that, are very, very valuable, right? Because they're in high demand and they're illegal. So if someone is selling them, they're taking a lot of risk to do so. And there's no regulation, so they can get robbed. There's all sorts of terrible things that can happen to them, so they have to be armed and ready. And then sometimes they go on the offensive because they're like I said earlier, they're battling over turf or whatever, and it tends to be that they use guns for these types of disputes that they can't hire a lawyer for, right? So there's people dying in the streets all over America, all over the world, but especially in America, with guns over drugs, and that is largely because drugs are illegal, regardless of how you feel about whether they should or shouldn't be. Drugs being illegal causes people to die over the sale of them, and guns are used in that. And then because of that, the government in turn says the problem is guns, right? They blame our guns, us law-abiding gun owners, for this violence that we have nothing to do with, right? So that's a problem, that people need to think about and that we need to talk about. The war on drugs has caused a lot of momentum for gun control, and that's a problem that needs to be talked about. I think that it's not talked about enough. Okay, so and then the next issue is states' rights. So as we know, there's a lot of states now who have legalized either medical or recreational marijuana. Not that that's two different types of marijuana, but people can get a license and do it, or they can just buy it from a store. Like Colorado, for example, you can just walk in and buy it, even if you're out of state. But it's still federally illegal. It's technically illegal to possess marijuana anywhere in the country. But there are states that have allowed it, and for the most part, the government has been okay with it, right? There hasn't been any serious crackdowns in a big way. I know that Jeff Sessions is trying to do something about it. But the momentum is there. It's going to happen, right? It's a matter of time until it's legalized. But what's interesting about that is that even though it's federally illegal, marijuana is still a Schedule I drug. The government seems very kind of lackluster about that. But yet, if your state decided that you want to have machine guns, let's see how that goes. So there's kind of a double standard there for guns and for at least with marijuana, and that's a problem. I do think marijuana should be legalized. I think machine guns should be legalized. I think we should have all that stuff. But there's a serious consistency issue in the government with that, and I don't honestly, I don't think it's fair if people can walk into a store and buy something that's federally illegal, but I can't do that with guns. That doesn't seem fair. So that's something else that needs to be talked about and thought about. Another thing too is ideological differences. That is what I see these two things coming into play, because both things, guns and drugs, there's obviously a huge movement that we're all a part of, probably if you're watching this video, to maintain the gun rights that we have and to also get more back. And then on the other side of things, and there's some crossover with this, a lot more than you would probably want to admit or realize, but there are people who want to see drugs either at least decriminalized or some of them legalized. There's all varying levels of it, of course. But there are huge ideological differences that people have that prevents people from being open-minded about those things. So let's talk about people who don't like guns, for example. If they grew up in a household where there were no guns and they only see the bad things that guns are doing on the news, then ideologically in their mind, guns are bad. And that's just, they've made up their mind, guns are bad. Everyone that they're around, they're in a bubble, guns are bad. So there's just no room for them to be open-minded about the topic. And the same thing happens with drugs. The government has put out so much propaganda about, even we'll just talk about marijuana, so much propaganda about marijuana. And if you live in a bubble and you've only been exposed to the propaganda and you don't have a balanced understanding of what it actually does or the real effects or any of the science behind it, then you're going to have dramatic ideological differences that will keep you from being open-minded about that. So they're kind of two in the same. Typically people who are pro-drug, you think of them as being anti-gun, and people who tend to be pro-gun, you think of them as being anti-drug. But a lot of ways the mentality is very similar. And me personally, I would love to be able to see both sides become more open-minded and meet in the middle. There's already a lot of people in the middle, but I would like to see people be more open-minded about both, because I think if we can figure out a way to work with both, then the world can be a lot happier because of some of the things I mentioned earlier in the video, especially with the violence, because nobody wants to see other people get hurt arbitrarily. Okay, another thing that's crazy to me, both guns and the use of guns and drugs are glorified in the media by movies, right? Almost any movie you turn on, there's guns everywhere and drugs everywhere, and a lot of times they're shown in a positive light or whatever, glorified. But yet the media typically attacks guns and promotes drugs, which guns are for the most part legal and drugs are not for the most part. Speaking about illegal drugs, of course. The whole term drugs, you could, everything from gambling and sugar intake all the way up to meth and heroin is, technically a drug. So it's this massive, spectrum, of course. So that to me, that's kind of ridiculous. And, we celebrate people that are known users of drugs, even though they're illegal, like Johnny Cash, John Lennon, and the Beatles, and all these rock stars and actors and all this stuff, and we celebrate the lives of these people who are open about their use of all sorts of different drugs, and we even laugh about it. We think it's funny, most people, and it's entertaining. But then if a regular person gets caught doing it, well, they're a bad person. They go to jail, So there's this weird double standard that happens, that if you're talented, you're allowed to do drugs, basically. It's kind of the way that works. And that sends a wrong message. There needs to be more consistency. I tend to lean, I'm not a libertarian, but I lean towards like, hey, let's just, get out of the way of each other's freedom. So you know how I probably feel about that, but that to me is crazy. The idea of that guns and drugs are glorified both almost equally by the media, but yet our guns are always under attack. It seems like, it's crazy to me. And then also government oppression. That's another thing, that the government uses the fact that drugs are illegal, and and that's one thing that scares me about this lackadaisical approach towards, especially things like marijuana, because what it sets it up for is it's kind of like, yeah, we'll sort of let you do that, but it's not technically okay. Well, what that means is that if they like you, then you can get away with it. If they don't like you, then you can't. And that's kind of been the thing with drugs. And initially, a lot of the drug laws were about basically keeping people down that the government didn't like the Vietnam War protesters, minorities. It's scary when you go down the rabbit hole of the history of marijuana prohibition, especially, and even some of the other ones. And then guns are the same way. Because they're so highly scrutinized, they can be used to control behavior. Through gun laws and regulations and all these different kinds of things. And it's like the government knows that people who own guns or that do drugs possibly are likely to be people who are not afraid to question authority and maybe think for themselves a little bit more and be a little bit more independently minded, and the government can use both of those things against you to take whatever they want from you, just through some arbitrary law or a law that already exists or whatever. And it's scary. That's why I'm a freedom guy. We got to keep the government out of our business the best that we can. And then lastly, my issue with both of these things being scrutinized, guns and drugs, is that they're essentially thought crimes. You're being punished for the idea that you might do something, essentially. Like with guns, let's talk about the guns that are already illegal in most places, are at least hard to obtain. I mean, technically speaking, you can obtain almost any weapon that you can think of. Just about anything. It's just they're out of reach for the common man. I mean, you can get C4 legally if you want to. It's just you have to go through an insane amount of stuff. But like with full auto and short-barreled rifles and things like that, the government has arbitrarily deemed those to be more dangerous. Well, we all know they're not dangerous on their own, so they're saying you don't get to have that because you might do something wrong with it, right? And that's where the whole theory behind gun regulations comes from. You might do something. Everyone knows the guns don't do anything by themselves, and that they can be operated. They can be stored and safely and everything. It'll just go off arbitrarily. Everyone knows this basically. So that's where it comes from. You might do something dangerous, so we want to just go ahead and nip that in the bud and not even let you have that. And that's ridiculous. That's treating people like cattle, and drugs are the same way. Theoretically, if you're taking drugs, it's something that you are putting into your own body that will only cause harm to your body. Now, because of the effect that drug has on your body, you might go and do something that causes harm, but you might, just like guns. Most people don't, right? So they're banning those things because of you might do something. And anything that's illegal because you might abuse it, it needs to be looked at with some heavy scrutiny, because again, it's like you're treating people like cattle instead of free thinking individuals. Does the government work for us or do we work for them? That's what we gotta decide, I feel like, at the end of the day. So anyways, the war on drugs to me has a negative effect on gun rights, and I think that it's something that we need to think about and try to be more open-minded about, especially with marijuana. Because there's a lot of issues now that are coming up in states where they do allow medical marijuana, but if you have a medical card, you can't buy a gun. So again, government oppression. They're using marijuana to keep you from owning guns, essentially, and I don't think that's good. I think that's wrong, and that's my take on it. So whatever. That's food for thought. I try to be as even as I can, on my opinions, but obviously I have my own biases. I've lived everyone watching this video has lived a different life than I have, and they've all lived different lives than each other. So all we know is our own experience and the things that we read and the people that we talk to, things that we hear. This is my take on it, and I'm not going to try to force you to think how I think, because I could be wrong, but this is how I feel about it. But I would like to force you to at least, think about these issues and talk about them. And I think it's something that gets sort of swept under the rug a lot in gun culture, and it's important stuff. All these things affect our lives every day, whether we realize it or not. So there you go. First episode of My One Take. And just like I said, I did this video all in one take. And also, before I go, I want to remind you to please, if you can, support the people who support this channel and make all this kind of stuff possible. budsgunshop.com. Go over there and check them out. I bet you can guess what they do at budsgunshop.com. And then also sdi.edu, the Sonoran Desert Institute. You can go over there and see what all they have to offer if you're looking for some firearms education. And they do accept GI Bill, so former veterans, keep that in mind. Can you be a former veteran? I don't think that works. Veterans, keep that in mind. And also, speaking of gun rights, please go to the link in the description and join the NRA through our link if you have not done that. And also Federal Ammo, we appreciate them because our guns are very hungry and we need lots of food for them. So anyways, I hope that you guys enjoyed this little first episode. Try to do more of these, and some of you guys may, I already know there's gonna be a lot of comments. Don't get political, blah blah, and all this kind of stuff. Look, we don't get political on Hickok 45, but this isn't Hickok 45. This is Hickok 45 and Son. I like to talk about this kind of stuff. I'll never talk about this kind of stuff in main Hickok 45 videos, but over here, like those of you who listen to my podcast, I like to talk about issues and stuff, but I do my best to, be centered about it to a certain extent. Because I'm a kind of in the middle sort of guy, for the most part. I'm not really conservative, not a liberal, not even really a libertarian. I'm just kind of a freedom kind of. There needs to be like a freedom party or something. I don't know. But I like talking about this stuff, like putting conversations out there and everything. And I get really annoyed that when people are very closed-minded and angry with their opinions and like they're trying to force them on you. So I try really hard to not do that. But at the same time, I do have, leanings and biases or things that I think. So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed it. And I'll see you on another video maybe.